College football nerds here talking Alabama and Georgia. We are so happy to see your lovely faces. Bama and Georgia fans, after your week off, resting up for this one, want to remind y'all, collegefootballnerds.com, our data for this year is live. It's free. You can model any two teams against one another. There's a wealth of data, both relative performance and our weekly 1 through 136, where we model all teams against all teams, and we rank them based on that. So there's no bias or anything like that. First week out is always a little bit wonky, but I'll remind Georgia fans laughed at us in 2023 when our model picked Auburn. I think that initially picked them to win, and then we noticed there was a little bit of a flaw, and it ended up being like Georgia by 1, and that game ended up being very tight, even though we were mocked for it. So model covered. Anyway, we're going to get into the model later, and we're going to discuss some things because it also is a little wonky, but it gives us some insight into this game, and I think it's pretty important. But Josh, let's start off with the fact that, Alabama, if Georgia fans are new to Alabama after the Florida State game, Alabama came out of the gate, struggled against Florida State, and was kind of almost immediately written off. But now you look at this game, Alabama's heading to Georgia, opened as a 3.5-point favorite for Georgia, which if the home team gets 3 points, that's kind of a pick 'em. And then now it's actually been bought down to 3 points favorite for Georgia. If Alabama was written off in week 1, then Vegas might see it a little bit differently.
Yeah. So as we said, we've released our model. We talked about it in a recap. Our model only uses this year's data, which means it has very little data to this point in the season. We'll kind of touch on that in a bit, and it's pretty wonky. But to your point, Daniel, our model has never really bought into this idea, or our modeling system doesn't buy into the idea that Alabama is dead and buried. One of the big things when you talk about any sort of sports team is your win-loss record is who you are from a ranking perspective, but it's not actually that useful from a predictive perspective. So we had a little, maybe our version of mini rant, which is a longer rant, that when you're talking about HP rankings and top 25s, I think you should look at the wins and losses in terms of the power ratings of who you beat and lost to, not the AP poll rankings. It's not Highlander. You don't beat a ranked team, and therefore you become ranked, even though that's the game we play. It's stupid. You should be ranked based on your wins and losses, but based on your wins and losses evaluated through the lens of the quality of the teams you beat, not the ranking or win-loss record of the teams you beat, if that makes sense. And from that perspective, Alabama is equally dangerous, because just because they lost a game against Florida State, where I do think they looked poor, maybe it's a game they should have lost, maybe it isn't, that doesn't somehow make Alabama more beatable. If anything, history's proven when you have a really good team that loses a stupid game, they tend to be much better through the course of the year. It tends to be something that kind of gives them an edge. Heck, last year, Notre Dame was one of the best teams in the country, beat Georgia in the playoffs. They started the year with an inexplicable loss to Northern Illinois. It happens in football. And look, that game happened because Notre Dame was unfocused, because they were flawed, all that stuff put together, that really had no impact on letting Georgia beat Notre Dame. So that's the thing I would say, Daniel. And I'll throw it back a little bit, too, to note, our model. We do a 1 through 136 power rating. Again, we always say our model's more of a trend predictor than a super accurate. In terms of a mean error predictor and scoring, it's not hyper accurate, but it's not built to be. Our model's really built to be more effective in terms of picking ATS. We are typically, the last few years, I think we've pretty consistently been one of the top 5 models nationally, Daniel, in ATS. I think a year or two ago, we were, the best tracked model. Andrew Percival does a pretty good ranking on that against the spread. The transfer portal era does pretty well, because not using priors actually helps you dealing with transfers. Our model right now thinks Florida State's the best team in the country. And there's not enough data. Look, Florida State has had a bye and has had FCS competition. Our modeling system throws out all FCS statistics for a wide variety of reasons. They can't be used, and even if they could be used, they wouldn't be useful. But it thinks that Alabama just lost to the best team in the country, is what our model actually thinks, which is an interesting point. And again, has no idea who Alabama is. So when you put all that together, what I'm saying, Daniel, is I think Georgia has their work cut out for them. I'm not shocked the spread is really close. I know Alabama lost a dumb game. For the purposes of this video, I don't know that I really care, because all that matters is the quality of Alabama going into the stadium. Alabama's undoubtedly motivated. I am more interested in who Alabama is. I'm more interested in who Georgia is. I think both teams have some particular flaws that we're going to get into and some things I've seen on tape. And I say all that to say, I'm more concerned with what Alabama does in terms of their trends to play poorly on the road and in terms of matchups, not whether Alabama's win-loss record is or is not deserves, because from this point forward, I think it's totally irrelevant.
So getting into these two teams and how they match up against one another, because that's one of the things that lost Alabama the game against Florida State, is that's just that Gus Malzahn offense, when they've got the perfect quarterback to run the system. It's week one. You're starting a new quarterback. Your running back goes down the week of camp, and you got two pretty mediocre backup running backs behind him. It was a perfect storm for Alabama. They still lost, and they earned the L. But that doesn't mean Georgia presents the same things that Florida State did. Having said that, and this might lean into my projection, which, by the way, this is going to be a long one, y'all. We know a lot about these two teams. We like to talk about these two teams, so it's going to just settle in, get a cup of Joe, and just enjoy it. Josh, we will talk about personnel. We will talk about statistics. We'll talk about the hard data of things. You don't like talking about the soft things in terms of, feelings-based stuff. But Alabama sucks on the road. Except for LSU last year, under DeBoer, Alabama, think to Oklahoma last year, think to Vanderbilt last year, Tennessee last year, away from home against Michigan last year, Florida State this year. Those are all on the road, and they all didn't look like the same team that they looked like when they played at home. Everything else aside, is Alabama kind of in a prove it to me that you can do it in not only a hostile environment, but kind of the hostile environment? Are they in that spot right now, or do you think that they can kind of transcend all that?
I absolutely think they are, right? So Alabama as an L versus Florida State. If you look back to 2024, games away from home, they played neutral site Michigan in the bowl. They lost. They played at Oklahoma. They lost. They played at LSU. Got the win. Before that, at Tennessee, they lost. At Vanderbilt, they lost. You have to go all the way back to September 14th to find something of a win streak with Wisconsin. So dating back, if you want to take it all the way back into 2023, right, with the bowl loss to Michigan, then from that point forward, they've won 2 games against Wisconsin and LSU, and they've lost 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They're 2-6 away from home, dating to the end of 2023. Daniel, that's insanely bad, right? We're not just talking 1 off, 2 off. That's atrocious. So, yes, I think you absolutely have to say they've got a problem, and they need to understand how to fix that problem. And we are not just in hypothetical territory in one-off situations. They are consistently playing worse on the road, and particularly, Daniel, offensively, they've been a disaster. There have been a lot of, I think, consistent things in that inconsistency, and inability to block has been a big one. We talk a lot about how, from a actual on-field technical play perspective, being on the road in hostile environments, in loud environments, one of the main challenges is it makes it harder to block, particularly on the edge, because you can't run regular snap counts. A lot of people move to the clap count thing, and when you're doing that, it means the tackles are relying on hearing the clap. It's a little harder for them to time their get off from, as opposed to a typical cadence. If you end up having to go silent count, everybody's watching the ball, which means the tackles no longer have an advantage in the snap count. So I think one of the things here, probably under the cover, so to speak, Daniel, I think Alabama's had issues because the offensive tackle play hasn't been consistently good. And if your tackle play isn't very good, or your line play isn't very good, in a hostile stadium, it affects you more because it's harder to block on the perimeter, and you have more trouble with speed rushers getting around the edge. I think some of it has been an issue at quarterback. I think Jalen Milroe kind of would get rattled at times. I think Simpson in his first start really got rattled. I thought he played okay for about 2.5 quarters. His tape, the end of the third quarter and fourth quarter versus Florida State, was really, really bad. He was pretty good, okay to pretty good through that point. I thought was doing well enough to be able to win a game normally if everything else is going the way it should. But when they really leaned on him at the end of the third quarter, he had a bit of a collapse in his first start. It's not shocking. And so, yeah, I mean, I think there are problems here. I think there's a consistent issue. They're playing again in a hostile stadium. It's going to be very loud. And so the question remains, and let me be clear, I don't think this is even a DeBoer thing, right? This really dates back to Saban. They've had this issue for a lot of issues, I would say. We've talked about this a ton. They originated under Saban the last couple years. They weren't really Kalen DeBoer problems. Daniel, what do you think is the cause of this? And do you think it's something that's going to continue in this game at Athens?
Josh, I got a question for you.
Okay.
Do you like paying full price for things, or do you prefer to save 10% when you can?
I mean, I'm a penny pitching lawyer. I love to save money where I can.
Well, you're in luck because we're partnering with SeatGeek this year. And with codes NERDS10, you can save 10% on tickets at SeatGeek. And they've got a lot of cool college football games. We're a college football channel. They also have other stuff like concerts and things like that. But we got Bama, Georgia coming up this weekend. I'm going to show it on the screen for people. We got the game at the end of the year, Michigan, Ohio State, Alabama, Auburn, Iron Bowl. Even the cocktail party is going to have some tickets for y'all. So SeatGeek is partnering with us, and I'm just curious, any games that you want to see? You going to stay on your couch all year? You got something in mind?
Well, I've never really experienced human companionship. And also as a nerd, I've only ever watched box scores. So given that I'm probably going to pick LSU to win, I'd kind of like to go to an LSU game. I mean, don't you think they'd be excited to have me?
I'm probably more excited than Penn State fans would be to have you. But, Josh, there's a problem with this. I think we found a flaw in your system. You can get some good prices on tickets, but do you want to know what the problem is?
What's the problem, Daniel?
You'll have to wear pants.
Oh, I've never done that before. And also, I think I have to pick them to lose if they want me to come.
All right. So, of course, we got the code for y'all, Nerds10, to save 10% off on your next tickets at SeatGeek. Make sure you click on the link in the description and download the app, and you can have the code automatically added to your account so you can use it later. I want to thank SeatGeek. They've been a great partner. This is 2 years running with them. We appreciate it. Y'all go check them out. I think part of it is there has been a little bit more parity, a little bit less depth at Alabama. I think that Saban, I think he had some issues with coordinators down the stretch, and those coordinators didn't have the authority that some of the previous ones had in terms of being able to hold guys accountable and keep that standard up. And, what was it? Dallas Turner, I think, said famously, or one of the Alabama defenders, that there was a lot of anxiety in the locker room, which is just something that you'd never hear from Alabama. But I also think there's this psychological effect when you are Alabama, when you are at Georgia, when you are in Ohio State, and you're the standard for a decade plus. When teams that aren't as good as you punch you in the mouth early, it kind of knocks you off your spot a little bit, and sometimes you just don't recover. And I think that has happened when Alabama is these players are looking around to everybody else like, okay, somebody's got to step up and do something at some point, and it just keeps not happening. And then you're in the third quarter and it's a game. And I think that messes with you mentally when you're so used to just beating the crap out of everybody. But Josh, I will say that I think that Georgia is getting a much better version of Alabama than Florida State got, if for no other reason that the offense looks a lot better. And, we talk about matchups in terms of what things teams do well, and Georgia fans hang on because I'm going to get to what y'all do well in a second, and what things they don't do great with. And right now, with everything that we have informationally available, which is not a lot, and I could be totally wrong in this, I think it's pretty clear that Alabama, if the mental thing is there for Ty Simpson and he doesn't have a meltdown, they've got a dude at quarterback. They've got probably the deepest wide receiver room in the country. Not the best, that's Ohio State, but they've probably got the deepest wide receiver room in the country. Offensive line's playing well. They're not running it well yet, but Georgia's problem right now is that they can be thrown on in a way that we haven't seen in the past.
Yeah, it is an interesting thing because, again, now we can start leaning on our model. And look, you can rag on all you want. It is too early. Stuff's very much in the air. In our defensive statistics, Georgia's pretty bad. And look, in terms of straight stats, they're bad. They're 101st nationally in yard per attempt defense, Daniel. And our metric's a little more forgiving for competition, but not that forgiving. It still has him 67th. And I will say it shows up on tape. And so this is the first time we're really going to talk personnel. I hate a little bit that it's negative, but I think if you're a Georgia fan, you probably see this coming given the way Tennessee and Marshall was. And look, if you're a Georgia fan, you've seen teams win national titles. You know what a national title defense looks like, and you know right now you're not there. Daniel, what I saw on tape from the Tennessee game, and I broke it down in some detail, was a personnel issue. So on one side, you have Everett, and they have KJ Bolden, who's the deep safety on that side of the field. Those guys are good. And Everett is a good corner. I don't know that he's perfect, but he's good. Good, solid corner. Averaged good corner that Georgia's had. Maybe not a first-round draft pick, but he's up there. KJ Bolden, I'm high on. I think he's kind of unduly criticized by some because I do think he's a very, very good safety. He gets compared to Malachi Starks, who was phenomenal. I don't think he's quite Malachi. Maybe he gets there. But he is very, very good. That is an NFL safety. I talk a lot about safeties, right, in modern college football and in the NFL. Because of the RPO, you can no longer key run pass. If you do come up on the run, the RPO is designed to throw past the safety and give up instant touchdowns. So the way safety's taught and played now is just very different than how it used to be. You see teams run a lot of deep cover 3, cover 4. You even see some analysts complaining about how much cover 3s run in college football these days from a lot of DCs. There's a reason for that. You can't key run pass, so what do you want to do with a safety? You make him a deep third cover guy. And that's just kind of the way you leverage good safety play these days because you can't really do a whole lot else. Maybe if they can actually run man coverage, you can run man coverage and they can't really help in the run game, and that actually causes you some schematic fit issues in the run game. But on that side, KJ Bolden and Everett, I think, are really good. But you flip it to the other side of the field, Daniel, and I think they've got issues because you have Kyron Jones, Aguero, and then the other side they had Robinson and Harris who were kind of rotating. I saw a lot of problems from that triangle. In fact, when you looked at all the big plays that Tennessee had, almost all of them came against that triangle of players. The early touchdown was kind of a post play. Jones was way underneath. I don't know if he had improper leverage or if the corner thought he was going to have help when he didn't. That's a thing that's, you're going to see a lot of people theorize on that, but you never know exactly how the coverage is called. I can just tell you the corner got beat. I can tell you he didn't have help. And what was important is they had Robinson, the young 5-star redshirt freshman out there, and he couldn't make a play on the ball. The ball goes down the field. There's contact. Robinson goes to the ground. It's the thing you can't do as a DB. You cannot turn towards the ball and end up on the ground because the receiver's just going to catch it and run the rest of the way. If you can't play the ball, play the guy, wait for him to catch the ball and tackle him. And it happened again. They had another deep shot. Harris was in that time, had poor position, mistimed his jump. Brazel went over his head. Now, Brazel's a really tall guy, snatches the ball. Harris goes to the ground. Tennessee scores. And they've rotated that corner all year. And I'm telling you right now, they didn't rotate at the corner position because they're happy with it. They're rotating because they know they have an issue. Julian Humphrey transferred to Texas A&M. He started most of last year. He had his own consistency issues. I kind of half wonder if Humphrey honestly would be starting for that team unit right now. I also saw, frankly, Aguero have his issues in the slot. The interception KJ Bolden had in that game, they actually rotated Bolden down to star. So it was effectively Bolden playing the slot instead of Aguero, from what I could tell on tape. And I think that's telling that they moved him down. Daniel, they have a real issue. This is not your typical problem where you're talking about a team that maybe gave up some points because they weren't motivated, because they had schematic issues. They've got a real personnel issue, in my opinion, on this football team. I think the outside corner position, that boundary corner where they're rotating Harris and Robinson, is a real weak spot. It's a problem because it's backed up by Jones, who I think is just not a great safety. He's certainly not Malachi Starks. Aguero is not a fantastic nickel who's, he's played some football, but he's his own problem. And if you think about it, last year's team, you lose 2 first-round pass rushers in Mikael Williams and Jalen Walker, a first-round safety in Malachi Starks, and you lose his backup in a 7th-round safety in Dan Jackson. It's not surprising that they took a big step backwards in terms of pass rush. But I think when you combine it all to the fact, and I think when I ran this stat, it was a week ago, but Georgia is 99th in sacks, 89th in tackles for loss. They don't rush the passer well. They're not disrupting behind the line of scrimmage. They don't have great corner play at one of the corner positions. They don't have great safety play at one of the safety positions. Daniel, I think that pass defense is vulnerable. From what I'm seeing on tape, this whole thing about them being 67th in the country in pass defense, I don't know that it's wrong. I think this defense needs major tweaks to figure out. They might be able to take steps forward during the bye week. And I know it's a long explanation, but I really wanted to explain it. They have a genuine personnel issue in the back end for the first time I've really seen in their Kirby Smart era. I think that leaves them particularly vulnerable. And we're going to talk about Alabama because they have their own flaws, I think, especially at offensive line in a minute. I think there are opportunities here for Alabama with a quarterback that's gaining confidence in a receiving core that probably is the second best in the country in terms of starters and probably, in my opinion, the best in the country in terms of overall depth to really make some headway to a Georgia defense given those vulnerabilities.
Yeah, Alabama's wide receivers are better than Tennessee's. And look, I don't know that the game plays out the way that game did in terms of this just sheer volume of points. But to this point, Alabama has been dangerously efficient. And I do want to talk about how they played against Wisconsin and some of the maybe misconceptions there. But I want to get into Georgia for a minute because we haven't talked enough about Georgia, at least offensively, and what's really good there. I was kind of mocked on Twitter when I said that Georgia was holding back in the Austin Peay game. That game was 28-6. It was an ugly game. I said they're holding back. Kirby Smart does this every year. Nick Saban used to do it all the time. They don't care how bad they beat Austin Peay. They want to beat Tennessee. They want to spring their offense on somebody. And so you don't spring it on Austin Peay to beat them 73-4, two safeties. They could beat Marshall 45. Marshall's terrible. That's not Georgia's fault. They beat Marshall 45-7, and they could have beat them with their third string. So there's no point in putting that tape out there for Tennessee to scheme against and to be ready for, and they sprung it on them. So I had two things that I said, Josh. One, I said this summer that Georgia's one of the 5 or 6 teams that's going to improve from last year at quarterback or in general in their passing game. And two, they were holding back for Tennessee. I think so far I've been proven right in both of those things. People see that Miami is undefeated and has beaten Notre Dame and beat Florida. Carson Beck's not playing great. Go look at the numbers and you'll see dig a little deeper and see Carson Beck's not playing great. And Tennessee's not a trash defense. So, I think a lot of people have this misconception that Tennessee might suck defensively, and that's why Georgia put up 44 on them. Gunner Stockton had a day, man. 23 of 31, 304 yards, 9.8 per, no interceptions, and he ran it effectively enough to get the ball moving. And so I think that presents some particular issues where in this game, if it plays out maybe the way I'm thinking, Alabama's going to score some points. Like I think this is a higher scoring game. I think Vegas has got this total like 53. I think we're busting through 53 in this game. This is not going to be like the Alabama-Georgia games of old. Unless Simpson has just a mental breakdown, Alabama's going to get some points. The problem is Alabama's defense has shown up in some games. I'm not convinced they're great. I think their offense, what they showed against Wisconsin, was great because Wisconsin has a good defense, but Wisconsin has an equally, if not more, bad offense. So what we've seen, really, what we know about this Alabama defense is just what we saw against Florida State. And I think the scheme and the matchup and the personnel is a little better in terms of what gives them fits. But Josh, Georgia's still going to get theirs on the scoreboard.
I mean, you can talk about the Tennessee game. Tennessee had 2 corners out. Another thing I'll just say as an aside I saw on tape with Tennessee, those young corners, they gave up plays downfield, but more than anything, they got pushed around. So Georgia could get the edge anytime they wanted in that game because the corners were getting driven backwards. They were clearly too young. And when you're a young corner, often it's physicality that's the biggest issue. You could see that. That's why Georgia had so much success with like Branch in the short game. They had Young a little bit on the short game, but especially the tight ends and Bell were kind of pushing and just driving guys back on the edges. It's all about matchups. In the Wisconsin matchup, to your point, Daniel, in our metrics right now, we have Wisconsin 85th in rushing, 51st in passing, which is probably generous because what I saw from O'Neal in the Maryland game that was one of the worst quarterback performances I've seen in a long time. It was just atrocious play behind what is a clearly really bad offensive line. We have them 60th in pass defense, which is bad, but maybe not horrific. But we have them 6th in rush defense. And to your point, Daniel, Alabama couldn't run on Wisconsin. They threw it well. And defensively, they shut down Wisconsin. And I think the takeaway there, Alabama throwing it as effectively and efficiently as they did is probably a good sign. I mean, and some of that when you're watching quarterback play, there's nuance you can tell, right? How fast is the ball coming out? If I watch a guy like you watch like Arch Manning versus Sam Houston State, and a lot of people want to say, oh, he's fixed all his problems. If you're sitting there going step, 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 and you're taking 4 or 5 seconds to throw the football, you actually still have problems. You need to run the way you run the offense. Simpson versus Wisconsin was getting the ball out extremely quickly. The line gave up some pressure, whatnot. I think there's still issues. But the fact that they couldn't run the ball doesn't surprise me. I think Wisconsin's run defense is probably elite, probably top 10 in the country. Might well literally be the best Alabama faces all year unless they get in the playoffs. But anyone that wants to say Alabama's defense is back because they stuffed Wisconsin, Daniel, I'm not buying it. Wisconsin's offense is terrible. Their offensive line is atrocious. The quarterback play is awful. They are terrible. So the biggest thing to me with Alabama, people are all focused on the offense because they really struggled against Florida State. I do think that they struggled because they were on the road in a hostile environment. And the first start for Simpson, I think there's a back issue, which I'll let you touch on because I know it's something we've talked about a couple times offline. But they also struggled defensively, and everyone's just assuming that's solved. I am not sold that that's solved. I don't think UL Monroe is a team that can actually push Alabama. I don't know that Wisconsin was even as good as UL Monroe. So if you believe that and you look at Georgia, who's become one of the better rushing attacks in the country, who has a great back in Nate Frazier, who has a really effective runner in Gunner Stockton, they are physical. They have really good tight end play. Alabama in the Florida State game, their biggest problem really was lateral movement. I mean, you can talk about Castellanos, and we talked about how Castellanos only had like 175-yard rushing game last year. I think he had 78 yards, something like that, versus Alabama that game. He didn't run overly effectively. He also threw like 14 pass attempts. The thing that killed Alabama is they couldn't stop the dive, and they got absolutely destroyed on perimeter runs. And they probably averaged 25 yards a play when they ran a jet sweep or a perimeter run, and a lot of that was because the safeties and the corners were getting blocked out of the play. Georgia's going to do that. They've got great tight ends. Dylan Bell is a big receiver. They're going to block on the edges. And so I agree with you, Daniel. I think this is a high-scoring game because on the Georgia side, I see a personnel issue that I think Alabama's going to attack. If they have time to make it work, which right now, because Georgia's not very disruptive really at all, frankly, this season, they're probably going to get time. They're probably going to eat. But Georgia, for their part, if they're smart, they're going to attack the edges. I haven't seen an indication that Alabama can get off blocks on the edge. And people talk about hesitancy. They're hesitant because they were struggling with the speed and lateral movement, and because there was so much traffic from blocking, it's hard to be physical if you're being blocked and driven backwards. And so those two things put together, I do think this is a higher scoring game. I mean, I really do. And I start to think we look into, take what you will from the Wisconsin game, but I think there's a lot more to it.
Somebody mocked me on Twitter this week because I said Ty Simpson is playing like a first-round quarterback. And what they missed in that was the draft class for quarterbacks this year is really bad. And it's a lot worse now than we thought it was going to be this summer. So a lot of him, in my opinion, being a first-round quarterback is partially because the draft class is bad. But also, he's playing great football. And again, if the mental thing doesn't show up, he's going to put up some points in this game. An undersold story about Alabama right now, and I don't know how much it matters in this game because of the style of play and where they're going to try to exploit. But Jam Miller's been out. The two backup running backs that they started the season with against Florida State are just bad. They're not going to be at Alabama next year. They're just. I think one of them had like 19 yards on 6 attempts versus La Monroe. But if Keenan's back, that shores up that dive. That shores up a lot that they struggled with at the line of scrimmage against Florida State. if Jam is back and relatively healthy, the running game is going to look better. It's still not going to look great against Georgia because Georgia's going to hold them under 4 yards a carry, I think. But there's a difference in what you can do offensively if you're running 1.5 yards a carry versus 3.7 yards a carry. Also, I think an undersold piece of this is Lawson having another month, 5 weeks, to come back from that ACL injury. When you're coming back from an ACL and you're cleared to play 7-8 months later, you're at 60%, 70%. But every single week after you're cleared to play is leaps and bounds improvements. Josh, I think that there's a path for Georgia to maybe win this kind of comfortably. But what we've seen in the past with Georgia is Bobo's going to do what Bobo's going to do. And in that vein, the way he approaches the offensive game every time I've seen him in a big game is the style of play that Alabama's well suited for. This defense is suited for certain styles of play really well, more so like really pro-style offenses that can shut them down. You say they can attack the edges, and I agree. There's an opportunity there, but Bobo's also pretty stubborn. And I think even in this Alabama game against Alabama last year, the shift didn't happen until it was too late. And so I wonder if there's a situation here where Georgia, like they did defensively against Milroe in the SEC championship game, and maybe potentially this time offensively, kind of coach their way out of taking what might really do well for them because it's not their normal approach to offense.
Yeah, and we're starting, I think, at this point to converge a little bit onto a lot of thoughts we have. I mean, first, you mentioned running backs, and I'll just briefly sort of emphasize that right now they've got Richard Young, who's averaged 2.5 yards per carry on the year, and Daniel Hill, who started as the backup, averaged 3.8. They ended up playing, I think, like a redshirt freshman, Kevin Riley, but he now leads the team in yardage at 5.2 yards per carry. Started in their last game. And he's clearly, I think, not as good as Jam Miller. But the point is, I think the backs they've had have been really, really bad. And under the radar, I think that was actually a huge contributing factor. Because when I watched tape of them versus Florida State, what I noted is there were plays that were getting stuffed, not actually because the line wasn't doing their job, but because the backs were not hitting the proper holes or seeing their cutback lanes in his own blocking scheme. It was actually pretty bad at times, to be frank. But to your point, I think there's an opportunity for Georgia because I think Alabama has certain issues. I think they've lacked physicality at the line of scrimmage. Keenan probably, assuming he's, we know he's a tightrope surgery. We kind of know what that means. He'll probably be something like 80%. It's really hard to judge that with big guys because they have to push off so much. Sometimes it affects them more than others. I don't know, but mechanically he'll be fine. It's more of a pain tolerance thing with tight ropes. Both these teams have seen their share of them. But I think Alabama's issues on the perimeter and blocking. It's something I talked about last year when Alabama lost that game to Vanderbilt and other places. They had a nickel, Devontae Smith, oddly enough, which is easy enough to remember, who was much more physical than the other guys, but was hurt off and on a ton. Devontae Smith transferred to Notre Dame, and the guy they've got playing there now doesn't seem to have that same physicality, and it's the same problem I saw before. Like in the Vanderbilt game, he got hurt. And the guy, once he came out, their ability to disrupt off the edge, to get off blocks and blow up plays on the perimeter dropped dramatically. And they've got the same problem. I just don't know, like you, if Bobo is going to exploit it. I have never been particularly high on him as an offensive coordinator. I think he's a very competent coordinator, probably a good overall coach. But his schemes are kind of, we do what we do. And it's kind of problematic. He's just not creative enough to me. You think what they were doing to the prior coordinator with Stetson Bennett, it's nowhere near as creative. It's nowhere near as fluid. They're not 2 steps ahead. If they are traditional Georgia and they attack Alabama with traditional plays, there's a lot of stuff Alabama's quite good at. I think Alabama probably has one of the better secondaries in the country, actually, in coverage. As much as I'm talking about them having a hard time getting off blocks, because I think there's a physicality issue, Dominic Jackson, their corner, I think is one of the very best coverage corners in the country. He's just not overly physical. And so if you're throwing downfield on him and you try to run a traditional offense, he's very good. And he doesn't even show up on tape because teams do not throw at him very much. And the other guy, Xavier Brown, is really, really good himself. They maybe have 2 first, second round draft pick corners on that team. And in the interior, I think they can get pushed back a little bit in the typical run game. But where they really struggle is where you get creative and pin and pull and a lot of motion like Florida State does. The linebacker play, in particular in that Florida State game, their eyes weren't very good. Eye discipline. They flow wrong. I think they call it like a swarm defense. I often wonder if they're not really keying assignment-based football as much as just flow to the ball. And it means they get fooled a lot by misdirection from what I see on tape. If Georgia leverages that, they can be really successful. If they don't, I think they could struggle. How much confidence do you want to give to that? And Daniel, I think I don't know if this is the time to get in the model, but, all this stuff comes back to say Georgia, in theory, has enough advantages to take on Alabama and do well. But it's the same I could say for Georgia in much of this year so far. In theory, they had a lot of advantages against Tennessee that should have been successful, but they kind of got burned by what I think is a particular personnel issue that was a lot of the points Tennessee got in that game. In fact, almost all the major plays on that side. And they weren't as efficient. And I'll leave it to you to respond, but I do want to add one thing in this, and it's sort of an aside point. I think there are a lot of Georgia fans that are going to talk about, but we scored 44 points on Tennessee, and Alabama only scored 38 points on Wisconsin. That's a bit of a red herring. And the reason for that is anytime you play Tennessee plays a hurry-up style of offense. They snap the ball very quickly. You get a lot of possessions. Georgia scored 44 points in 14 possessions, which means they scored about 3 points per possession. Alabama scored 38 points. They did it in 9 possessions, which means they actually scored over 4 points a possession. Alabama was a lot more efficient per drive than Georgia was in those two games. And I don't know that Wisconsin's defense isn't better than Tennessee's. So on paper, Alabama's offense may well be better than Georgia's, Florida State game aside. I think the issue is that Alabama has some particular things they're weak on. And so the question isn't really, is Georgia better defensively than Alabama, blah, blah, blah. It's, are you able to do the things that the other team is bad at enough and well enough to be able to get an edge to win the ball game?
Before we get in the model, I've actually been more impressed with Alabama's offensive line, I think, than you and others. Mainly in pass pro, it's hard to know what they're doing from a run blocking standpoint when, like, Wisconsin was 7+ boxes. I think I sent you a screenshot of when we were watching tape. There was a 10-man box at one point. You're not running on that. But I do think there's probably an issue for Alabama on both lines of scrimmage, not being the Alabama of old. Is it fair to say that Georgia has a little bit of the same issue, both offensive and defensive lines? Answer that and then get us into the model.
They do. I mean, Georgia fans are very well aware at this point that they had at times a turnstile at right tackle. The right side of that line is not good. I thought Gunner Stockton played better than I thought he did when I went back and looked at the tape because I didn't realize how bad the line play was at times, frankly. I mean, look, Georgia's been plenty effective. I think Georgia has the better run game despite that, which says a lot about Frazier in the backs. I think it says a ton about the tight ends that are really good, and they've kind of made a lot of things work that wouldn't otherwise work. But yeah, with all that said, when you look at these two teams, what they are, we can get in the model. I'm just going to go ahead and predict, Daniel, at some point we're going to find a bug because we changed data providers, and this is the first week we're doing it. But hey, guys, the two of us built the entire website at collegefootballnerds.com. You can model any two teams you want. You can look at our statistics, the relative performance statistics we generate, which are saying, hey, your opponent's averaged 4 yards a carry. You allowed 5. You did 25% worse than expected. I think that's more usable, frankly, in a sport with very different levels of competition than straight yard per carry, yard per attempt statistics on their own. But you can go around and play with it. You can look at our rankings. It's trend predictors. It's been very good against the spread. It is what it is. Understand it. Look at the stats. But we built it ourselves. We put it out there for free. We paid to run the server, and we actually paid to license the data for it. So I hope you guys enjoy it and understand we do it as a labor of love, and we're not really making money on it.
We built it ourselves, but I am a software engineer with 25 years of experience, and you are an actual engineer. So I don't want people to think that it's like some hokey little thing. Like it's legit. Like it's really good. So continue.
For those that don't know, I'm an attorney that specializes in artificial intelligence, and I am an electrical engineer as well. So there's a lot of machine learning stuff and whatnot on the back end. It's not a dinky model on the back end. I'll say that. But our model, calling it not a dinky model and understanding it's week 4, it has this game lopsided. Now, big asterisk. Our model only uses data from this year. It's a philosophical choice. There are a lot of reasons it could be worse. We don't want to put it out there as like a giant media model, but it makes it one of the best trend predictors, which is the point of it. And it also takes the whole recruiting ranking, priors, bias stuff out the window. Our model doesn't have a clue who you are from your logo or name. It reinvents the whole wheel every year by itself in terms of your team, your performance, creates scoring methodologies for each team based on what has or has not worked for you in the past, which is kind of an interesting wrinkle I don't know others do. But it's a totally different mathematical model as far as I'm aware from anybody else in the space. It has Alabama pretty dominant. It has Alabama in this game 52, Georgia 30. Alabama 8.4 yards per play, Georgia 5. Alabama 10.9 yards per attempt, Georgia 6.5. Alabama 5.4 yards per carry, Georgia 4.1. There is a huge asterisk I have to put in with a limited amount of data, and it is a byproduct of how our model works in a year with a double bye. People that follow our channel know that we don't put our model out until after 4 weeks of data. I'm actually going to give you a peek behind the curtain for why that is. Our model looks at the teams you played, looks at who they've played and how they did against those, and creates multi-order sort of ideas of expected performance for your opponents, their quality, and uses their quality to then extrapolate your own quality based on how you did against them. Everything's highly relativistic in our model. But there's a couple things we don't use. One, we don't use FCS data. The reason for that is really twofold. One, FCS as a competition level is too poor. So teams against FCS opponents typically are going to generate whatever yardage they want to generate. And that means whether you're high or low doesn't mean anything more than how you kind of cap yourself. Two, I can't generate second level statistics because FCS teams pretty much only play other FCS teams. And that means whatever the FCS team's good or bad run defense is has no relation to what an FBS team does against them. So there's no way to have a meaningful relativistic statistic. So we throw FCS data completely throughout. Our entire model, all our statistics, we're behind the scenes, we're warehousing and analyzing and compressing into the data you see. We're throwing out FCS data all across the board. Well, here's your issue. Florida State hadn't played many bowl games. This is a double bye year, which means a lot of teams have played bye weeks early in the season, and a lot of teams have also played in FCS early in the year. Florida State's played 3 games: Alabama, Eastern Texas A&M, and Kent State. And to pull back the curtain even a little bit further, when we run a lot of our relativistic data, when we look at Alabama and how they did against their opponents versus how they did against everyone else, one of the things we do to cleanse the data behind the scenes is we take out the data where your team played their team. So when we look at how Florida State did, we don't include the statistics from Alabama playing Florida State to evaluate Florida State's offense and defense for relative data. The problem is with a bye and an FCS opponent, that means Kent State is the only game our model can actually use. So because of that, and because Florida State shut down Kent State in the run game, suddenly Alabama not running the ball well at all versus Florida State means they have a dominant run game, because the only team that played Florida State and Kent State could not run the ball whatsoever at all. So it has Florida State with an excellent run defense, excellent run defense, and that means Alabama's run offense ends up actually looking good despite how bad it was, if that makes sense. That is a data point that within 2 weeks will probably take care of itself. That is a data point that I could put in extra controls or barriers or something, especially if I use priors, that would clean itself up. But Florida State's also a team with...
The counter to that, Josh, though, is that Wisconsin is really good run defense, and they have several data points to show that.
Yeah, this is true. But again, Alabama didn't run the ball well against Wisconsin. Is kind of the flip, right? So the thing I'll say is that Florida State is a team with 17 transfers. So if I use priors, I would tell you what you think you should know. But Florida State is as close to a 12-0 team as they are to a 10 team. This is not like... There's like 5 starters back from last year's unit. Everybody else, the entire offensive line for them, every single one of those guys is a transfer 5th-year senior. So like it wouldn't really work other than to maybe make you feel like it was more relevant. But yeah, to your point, 3.3 yards per carry against Wisconsin, 72 yards rushing sounds bad, but we have Wisconsin as an absolutely phenomenal run defense. They haven't given up 3 yards per carry in another game. They've only, Maryland kind of thumped them at 2.6 yards per carry. The first two games, they didn't even give up 35 yards rushing. So, yeah, that is why this game is so lopsided in the model, why it has this game 52-30. I don't think, Daniel, that Alabama's deep offense is quite as good as this is predicting, partly because I think the rush attack for Alabama is skewed by all these variables we're talking about. I do think Alabama's passing attack may be that good, though. And so if you scale that down a little bit, maybe, we played around with multi-order scores. Daniel, maybe I'll let you talk about that. I think it was like 36-20 or something like that. When we messed around with a model to try to correct for it, which we can do behind the scenes, it still favors Alabama, but a little bit closer than you're seeing right now on paper.
I think really all it did for the most part was it just calmed the scores down a little bit. But the thing it's flagging right now, and for better or worse, like Georgia fans can come at us about it, but Marshall did better than their baseline passing the ball in a per play number against Georgia than they did in other games. Tennessee did better against Georgia than they did against Syracuse, than they did against UAB. And so from that standpoint, it just doesn't think right now Georgia is a good pass offense. Now, the flip side of this is, just like Georgia was holding back offensively, they're not really doing that defensively. So I don't think we're going to see something from Georgia that we haven't seen so far. Like everything's out on tape now. Everything's on paper for everybody to look at, both Alabama and Georgia. And I think what we've got is what we're going to have for the rest of the year for both of these teams, for better or worse.
Yeah, and, Daniel, I'm going to put you on the spot to make you do a little bit of work, maybe to throw it up on the screen. But maybe we can just use the screenshot. It used to be I had to do these models all by hand. And I went through and I actually did hand calculate the Georgia-Alabama score because I was curious. And that actually has Alabama 20, Georgia 16. So a much, much lower scoring game when I use the old model. The reason is we're doing multiple passes of data. When I did this by hand, I did it in Excel. I could only really do one order of those statistics. And it meant the Florida State issue doesn't really happen. And we couldn't extrapolate, Alabama data gets thrown in for Florida State, stuff like that. Alabama 20, Georgia 16, which is a little closer. But it's still, to your point, Daniel, it still favors Alabama. And you still have Georgia in our system is a pretty bad pass defense. I mean, it was 6% below or 6% worse than opponents' averages for their pass defense. In our current system, we have their passing defense, as I said, 67th. It would actually be lower than that in our older system, not that we did rankings with it. And I think that's the key, is however you want to take the score out, which I think is goofy, frankly. And I'll note it's an Alabama issue. It's really not a Georgia issue. It's an Alabama issue because they happen to have played two opponents in Florida State and ULM both, who both have had a bye week and both have had an FCS opponent. And so there's not enough data for those two, and it's creating a particular problem with Alabama in particular of all the teams in our system. But I think it's right that Georgia has a pass defense problem. And Daniel, this is the other thing I'll say, is our model right now, in terms of its top 10, you can go look at its 1 through 136 rating. And again, totally blind in how it does it. Doesn't even know the names of the teams behind the scenes until it runs the data. It has Florida State, the number 1 team in the country, and it has Alabama, the number 3 team in the country. Our model's current opinion, based on only on-field data, is that Alabama lost to the best team in the country in a game where they fell behind early and couldn't claw their way back in. It thinks that Alabama and Florida State are both hyper-elite teams, and Alabama just lost to a more hyper-elite team. I don't know, Daniel, that that's going to pan out. I personally think Florida State's defense is probably a little more suspect than that. But I think it's interesting. Our model also thinks Georgia currently is the 25th best team in the country. And it thinks Tennessee is the 40th best team in the country. I think those two things are too low. And I think a lot of that has to do with relative competition. Georgia doesn't like to show things early in the season. Our model is only based on field results. So when you sandbag, our model doesn't know you're sandbagging. Is an important thing to understand. But I think all that is to say that it is kind of interesting in that our model really thinks that Alabama is undervalued. And the biggest reason it thinks Alabama is undervalued, and I maybe this is the crux to take everything away, our model thinks Florida State is currently playing like the best team in the country. So our model doesn't really care that Alabama lost badly to Florida State. Our model thinks that that was basically Alabama losing badly to Ohio State. And if you lose to the number one team in the country by a couple touchdowns, you can still be the second or third best team in the country. And that right now, as far as our model sees it, that's what it thinks Alabama is.
Yeah, and I will go, if you look at production in the Florida State Alabama game, it was actually pretty close. I mean, total yards were it was 341 to 382. First downs 18 to 20. Rushing yards per carry weren't that far off. I think that, that's the other thing is our model doesn't really care that much about final scores either. And then we have points per drive in the new model, and that's a little bit where style of play comes into effect in terms of what it thinks Alabama's going to do versus what Georgia's going to do, because Alabama and Wisconsin ran combined 10 more plays than Georgia ran alone versus Tennessee. So there's a lot going on there. I'm ready to make a prediction on this. I think Alabama is a better team than Georgia. I think if this was on a neutral field, I think Alabama is 6 to 7 points better than Georgia, just because of matchup. So I don't know that necessarily they're a better team than Georgia, because I think Georgia could beat Florida State, but lose to Alabama. And that's the beauty of college football. I think it's a matchup thing. I do think Alabama has an elite passing game. I think maybe one of the best in the country because of what you said with, the wide receiver room, running backs can catch. I think Ty Simpson is highly underrated. But on the flip side, I think Gunner Stockton is the guy that I said he was going to be this summer. And I don't think Alabama has shaken off that. I don't know. I don't know if they've shaken off the road thing or not, but I'm not going to give them credit for doing it until they actually do it. And buried in this, but LSU last year is LSU got just run out the building, home or away, when they faced a running quarterback last year. Stellars did it to them. It was like 4 in a row of guys just running all over them, and it took the air out of the ball in that game, out of the crowd, everything. This game's at 6:30. It's not a 2:30 game. So if you watch the 2:30 game, Auburn versus Oklahoma, and it was kind of an ugly back and forth game, that crowd was not in it. That crowd was nowhere near the crowd that was present for the Michigan game 2 weeks prior. We're going to get the Oklahoma-Michigan type of crowd. We're going to get Ohio State-Tennessee type of crowd. We're going to get Neyland Stadium at any point type of crowd in this game. And I think because of that, until Alabama shows me they can win one of these on the road, I've got Georgia in this one 34-31, and I honestly don't think that Bama's out of any kind of playoff hunt. And if Georgia wins this, having already beaten Tennessee and Florida kind of looking pretty awful, Georgia can kind of moonwalk to the playoffs.
I overall have to agree with where you're coming in from, Daniel, which is I think Alabama on a neutral field right now or at home is the better team. The question to me is, how are they going to play on the road? And I say the better team, right? Because I agree with you, too, that I think it's a matchup issue. I think there may be a diamond where Florida State pretty consistently beats Alabama. Alabama beats Georgia some of the time, and then Georgia consistently beats Florida State. That triangle makes a lot of sense to me because of matchups and how they play football and the strengths and weaknesses of those rosters. But I'm still going to – Daniel, I'm going to pick Alabama by a slight amount. I mean, I'm going to pick Alabama 31-27. I think Alabama's going to have their issues in terms of their ability to maintain their composure. I'm really worried because from what I see from Simpson and Stockton both, is that both of them have really good moments, and then when you flip away from the highlight tape and you go and actually watch all 60 minutes. And I'll say, if you ever want to break down film and really break down film on a team, you cannot watch highlight tapes, because for a quarterback, the passes they miss are usually more important than the passes they make. There are a lot of guys like that, like Joe Milton, people fall in love with because you don't watch the tape and you don't see all the routine passes that he misses. There are a lot of quarterbacks right now that are like that in football, honestly. I think, Simpson looks really good at times, but I do worry a little bit when he plays zone defense, especially the opener, but I've seen it really multiple games. Early on versus Wisconsin, he looked rough. He doesn't really act decisively. And I think there are going to be opportunities for them versus that Georgia secondary. And I mentioned those two plays. There was also a third touchdown where Jones and I think it was Robinson were on the same side of the field, and they busted and let a guy go clean through. They didn't maintain their assignment. So it was 21 points that was given up by either techniques or assignment bust by those players. Alabama's going to have opportunities. But the thing is Simpson willing to throw the ball down and let his receiver play the one-on-one, or does he get too nervous and hold the ball and get pressured? I think right now, and I know they've got Cole and they've got some guys, but the lack of pressures from Georgia, I think, is kind of the key. Even though it's away, if that pass rush continues the way it's been this year, right, where one sack versus Tennessee, one sack versus Marshall, and again, you even look at like tackles for loss, 2 tackles for loss total versus Tennessee. If they can't get in the backfield versus Alabama, I think it's going to let Simpson get some rhythm, and I think he's going to be comfortable trying to target that secondary. And I think Alabama's going to target that half of the field probably 80% of the time, frankly. If they can get pressure, I think he can get rattled. Then the crowd can get into it, and I think that's the whole ball game. I'm kind of betting right now on the fact that I don't think Georgia's ability to disrupt is good enough, or it hasn't shown me to be good enough. I'm a bit notorious between the two of us, Daniel, right, that I tend to not probably undervalue a lot of times the emotional aspects and overvalue the statistical or performance aspects being consistent week to week. Georgia at home in this environment may ramp up their pass rush, maybe causes Alabama to be rattled to a degree I haven't seen. But that's what I'm predicting, 31-27. But Daniel, ultimately, our real prediction is the same for both of us, I think, right? Which is that if both teams sort of play their game and Alabama isn't rattled on the road, Alabama from a matchup perspective has the advantage in this game. I think we both feel like. I think both of us feel like Georgia man-to-man probably is not a worse team than Alabama in terms of average personnel. They may very well easily be a better football team man-to-man, but the particular matchups with these teams and how Alabama plays football right now aren't good. Alabama's a passing team, not a very good run team. That is not what Georgia wants to play. They want to play a really good run team that throws the ball some. That's who Georgia will be. And so I think that gives enough of an edge for Alabama. But again, it entirely depends on whether or not Alabama shows up defensively and offensively, and whether Ty Simpson is aggressive enough against a Georgia team that now plays more zone than man to take those shots. Because if he tries to eat the ball and they play turtle, Georgia's going to kill
him. I could see Alabama beating Georgia and losing to Vandy again next week. Because Vandy's really good. They're a better version of who they were last year. Josh, one final thing I want you to touch on, something I observed going back and watching the Alabama game again. Talking about teams holding stuff back. Alabama has not thrown the ball vertically all year. I think they took one deep shot against Florida State that was kind of a third and long bailout shot. Wasn't really a design play. And they had the one deep corner that Simpson didn't see against Wisconsin. But otherwise, Wisconsin told Alabama with their alignments that, they walked their safeties up within 6-7 yards of the line of scrimmage. Alabama could have thrown a deep ball all day long against Wisconsin, and they never did. They could have thrown it all day long against La Monroe, and I don't think they did. I suspect they actually have been holding some of that back for, not necessarily for Georgia, just because the game hasn't dictated that they needed to do it. If they needed it against Wisconsin, they could. And I also think that the running game might be enough good with Jam probably coming back that it keeps the passing game vibrant. Tell me if my deep ball theory is maybe hitting on something.
I think you're hitting on something, but to me, the cause is probably a little different. Like, I don't know that I would say they've been holding back on it. They were in control of Wisconsin game enough. And I will say they were having enough success in the intermediate passing game that maybe they weren't trying to take deep shots. But I don't think it was so much that they were holding back from not needing it. I think they were holding back because the offensive line was getting beaten. And again, I actually think Wisconsin's front seven, and I watched their game this past weekend too against Maryland. I think they're quite good. Maryland couldn't run the ball. They got some disruption in Maryland in the backfield. Their secondary had issues, but a lot of the reason that Maryland scored, I think they had like 3 drives of less than 40 yards or something. Like Wisconsin could not move the ball at all and turn it over a ton. But they're highly disruptive. And I think Alabama, from a game plan perspective, knew they wanted to get the ball out fast. Both these teams have issues with the right side of their line. I actually think Georgia's maybe worse than Alabama, which is not a great thing to say. I think Georgia has probably going to have a better situation because they figured some things out at the offensive line, playing multiple guys and having one that was just, bless his heart, a turnstile. Alabama, too, though, I think has figured some things out. They rotated in the second quarter and replaced with their guard. The right guard had been out with a concussion, and they've got like a 5-star offensive tackle they plugged in for a little bit, and they were frankly a lot better, I think, in that period. I think you might well see Alabama and Georgia both have a different look on the right side of the offensive lines in this game. And Daniel, but I ultimately think that was the biggest factor, is that Alabama didn't think they really had time. I think they felt like they had enough of an advantage and they were being efficient enough, right? And look, like when we talk about efficient, if you're not following it, Ty Simpson on the year, and I'm doing this, I do this stuff live, and I think I'm good enough with it. It's kind of fluid. The last 2 games, he's thrown 5 incompletions. He was 17 of 17 versus Louisiana Monroe, 24-29 versus Wisconsin. That's ridiculous. His quarterback ratings of 239 and 270, which is nuts. After a pretty mediocre day in the opener against Florida State. So, given that level of efficiency, I just don't think they felt like they really needed to throw downfield. And obviously Louisiana Monroe, they really didn't need to. But I do think if they can shore up the offensive line, that will change. And I don't know that Georgia is as disruptive as Wisconsin, because that's the one thing they're really, really good at. Their defensive line, they were all hurt last year, realize, when Alabama ran over them. They're much better at their defensive line this year. I think that was a particular weakness, and if they can shore it up and they can get time, I think Alabama may throw the ball deep a lot more than they did really any week so far this year.
All right, y'all. Let us know in the comments what you think this score is going to be, and if we were wrong about our guess that Alabama's going to have a lot of success in the passing game against Georgia. Let us know if you think maybe it's just because they played 2 crappy opponents. All right, y'all. Remember, collegefootballnerds.com. It's free to you. Play around with the model. Play around with whatever you want on the site, and let us know what you think about it. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. Thanks for hanging on this long. God bless.